Hi, this is Sean Thomas again. Welcome back to part 2 of my Photoshop tutorials. In today's tutorial we're going to be going over photo editing, a couple of editing functions and the variations to how we can do it. As I mentioned in the first tutorial, there's many ways to skin a cat, so I'll kind of show you all the variations and then my preferences. I'm a bit of a lazy retoucher, so I tend to use the easiest versions. But to start off, let's open a picture. So as I mentioned in the first tutorial, let me show you that shortcut as well. To open an image, you can either go here up to the file menu and you say file open, and it will open up a place for you to navigate to find a document. Alternatively, you can just double click in this copyboard area and it will do the same thing. Okay, let's head up to the desktop. I have a shortcut for my stuff. If you click in there and just hit the first letter, it should take you more or less to where you want to be. Oh, there it is. Okay, that wasn't such a shortcut after all. Let's go into let's see, retouching. I'll do some color correction. Okay, all these files that I showed you there, they'll be on the disk as well for you to open and try and imitate the retouching I've done to see how accurate you can manage the tool. This is an example of a school shoot or a play where you have low lighting, you have all sorts of colors of lights for spotlights on the stage, so it's very difficult to set a white balance on your camera. Even the auto white balance will sometimes get it wrong. So what we want to do here is try and edit this picture in a means that it will turn out looking like this one here. If I turn on this other layer here, I'm just going to show you the final result. Okay, so pretty drastic difference, but I'll show you the easy way of getting there. Okay, I have on the disk, I'll supply the PSD file, which is the layer file, the Photoshop file, and it will give you basically all the steps down the right hand side here and the items I've used to accomplish this final result. So in this one here, I've used a filter. See this little icon here? This is the same as this icon down here. This is all your adjustment layers basically. You can make adjustments without using a layer, but as I mentioned before, layers help you to easily undo something that isn't quite working for you anymore. So if you start out with an idea and eventually you think, okay, well, this isn't quite working, maybe you need to adjust it slightly more, you can just select that layer and modify it. So I'm going to select this top layer, hold in shift and click on this other layer to select all these layers, and then I'm going to click and drag them to the trash can. So I'm going to start basically with a base, the original flattened layer. So this is my background, this is just my image, and now I want to make that color adjustment. So I'm going to go into the adjustment layer here. As I click on it, it'll give me a whole bunch of options of different things I can do to this layer. Let's go through each of them, and then we'll get to the color adjustment. So solid color, once again, there's some functions I never use. For me, it doesn't really make a sense why I want to do that. I mean, putting a solid color here is the same as just adding a fill, so I can select something there and it will fill this whole area with a solid color, which is the same as selecting, double click on here, selecting a red and saying edit and fill. So in order to fill a layer like this, so let me just create a new layer and you'd say edit fill. There we go. And you want to fill it with a foreground layer once again. So that's the same principle. Okay, the only difference is this is now for creating it with a mask. Like I said, I'll go into masks a bit later. So click and drag those to the trash can. I want them not really appropriate for now. Gradient, I guess these are just shortcuts of actually using the actual gradient tool or the pattern tool. From here on down is more your adjustments. So you can adjust your brightness and contrast. All of these adjustments here are also available here. If you go up to Image, Adjustments, and you do them here, it's identical. If you look at the options, they're identical to what's down here. The difference though is if I make an adjustment here, let me do on hue and saturation. Hue and saturation, the hue is basically the cast, the color cast. So if you want to adjust the color cast, which will be your hue, instead of current color, I can add a bit more blue if I drag it to the right. Okay. Or red, whichever. That's going to adjust relative there. And saturation is basically the intensity of that color. If I drag it to the right, I'm making it more intense. If I drag it to the left, I'm making it basically grey. So in between your 1 and 0 is basically your neutral spot. Lightness, this is how bright that hue is going to be, so I can increase it, I can decrease it. So yeah, those three functions. And this is very coarse way of adjusting. If I click on the colorize, it's then going to blend those colors into the photograph, so it's going to be a bit more subtle. So you can create things like a sepia tone. Okay, so I'll adjust the brightness then, make it a little bit more red or brown, dragging it to the left. Okay, so I'm happy with that. I'll hit OK, and that looks fantastic, but maybe I want to change it. Now you're stuck because it's basically made a change onto that background layer, onto your original piece of paper. It's changed that layer. And that's something you don't ever really want to do. You don't want to affect the original content. The moment you start affecting that, you basically start playing with the quality of your pixels. So instead of doing that, let's go back to the history brush that we learned about, or the history learned about in the first lesson. Let's click up on the original document to reset it. Actually, we don't want all this rubbish here, so let's go back to where we trashed it. We deleted layers. So just after that, let's go on to the delete layer. Okay, close that window again. Okay, so alternative to that, hue and saturation, we go down to the adjustment layer. So it's making an adjustment, but it's putting it onto a layer. We can say hue and saturation, and here instead of opening a window here, to open it up here, the same options. So say I want to drag it back down here, I want to add that sepia effect again, so I'm going to say colorize and make it a little bit more vibrant, a little less red, and maybe make it a little darker. Okay, so I'm happy with that, so we can move on to the next thing. So maybe create another layer, and I can paint a red on the, let's make it a different color for change, let's do a green. That's okay, and select my brush, and I want to write, make my brush a bit smaller using the square brackets. I'll write play. Okay, so that's on its own layer now. So if I turn that off, it's not going to affect. But now I'm deciding this brown and this green are clashing a bit. It's not really working so well for me. I want to adjust that brown a bit, make it a little bit less. So I come and click on here, back on this adjustment layer, the hue and saturation, and it'll then open this window. So this window is always active. So now I can come in here and I can maybe adjust it a little bit more, make it, maybe I want to have it all greens for whatever odd reason. Okay, so that's the difference between doing the adjustment layer via here. I used to use this extensively until I found out about this, and since I found this, there's really no other option. I wouldn't even bother going up here for your adjustments. Just keep to your layers here. If it comes to the stage where you say, okay, well, I'm happy with this, I'm never going to change it, and I would like to combine it with the background layer, then you basically hold your shift button in with this layer selected, and you shift and click the background layer. And you can then combine those two layers by going up to this little pull down menu here. Each of these windows has a pull down menu which gives you additional options related to the active panel. Active, by active I mean the one that's not hiding behind it. You'll see there's a couple of different options here. If I go through here, it'll give me a couple of different options. Okay, so this active panel is well, this panel here, layers, is active. So I'm going to go up to the pull down menu, and it's going to ask me what I'd like to do. And I don't want to flatten it, because flattening, as I mentioned last time, is basically like an iron print. It's going to flatten everything. Everything in my layers is going to squash it into one. and I don't want that to happen. I want to keep this play on a separate layer, but I just want to combine the effect I've given to the bottom one. So I'm going to say flatten, I'm going to say merge layers. If I say merge visible, it's going to flatten everything that's got a little R next to it, that's basically able to be seen. I want to merge the layers that I've selected, so I just say merge layers, and it's going to squash them together. There we go. So now that's basically the same as having said image adjust, and I've done it, except by the time I've done this, I'm now content that that's where I want to be. So that's the wonderful joy. Let me just go back up here of to there. I'll minimize that. That's the wonderful adjustment of these things. So levels is basically adjusting, or brightness or contrast is what it says. You can adjust the brightness of your picture, making the whole picture lighter, darker, or you can increase the contrast, which is the difference between the lightest area and the darkest area of the image. By dragging this up, you're making a lot more contrasty, so making the shadows darker and the highlights brighter. By dragging it down, I'm making the highlights and the shadows more even, so it looks very flat. So this is making your picture more edgy versus making it very flat and boring. So it's the fine line between the two, reaching a happy medium. I don't know, whatever your taste is, whether you like edgy or you like flat. I guess each picture that we're working on has its own merits. So that would be the brightness and contrast tool. I want to get rid of it, I'll just click and drag and put that in there. As I mentioned, I'll show you the masks in a bit of a later stage. At the moment, just going through all the different effects. So brightness and contrast levels, this is something I use quite often. Histograms, for those of you who don't know how to read a histogram, this is basically a representation of the tonal range of your image. So let me get this, with that selected. Picture this base area here as your image, pretty much. And this is showing you a representative from the left hand side being your shadows, the right hand side being your highlights. This little thing here is telling me that there's something not well. Something's cutting off somewhere, so I haven't got detail over this entire area. Somewhere the detail has been cut out and it's flattened. So let me give you an illustration of that. If I take this highlight here, the little white one compared to the shadow represented by the dark, this is your mid-tones. If I take this highlight and I drag it to the left, I'm going to brighten up the picture. But all these pixels here, all these pixels this side are basically getting cut off. So you're getting things like this, where it's flattened. Let me zoom in for you. So I've lightened it up so much that there actually isn't any detail there. It is completely white. And that's not a situation you want to have in your picture. Conversely, if I drag, if I drag the shadows to the right, I'm doing the opposite, but with the shadows. So you see I've darkened the shadows so much that I've just got solid black. There's no detail. So if I Control or Apple 0, it's not giving me a wonderful effect. It's a bit harsh. So you don't really want to cut off any pixels. If you can't see, if you want to be doing really meticulous work and you want to be able to see where your pixels are getting chopped off, then you go up to this panel. Sorry, it doesn't have to be in the raw editing. That's another good reason to do raw. As I edit this, take a look at this histogram here, how it suddenly gets holes in it. It means it's basically destroying the picture. It's not doing a very good job of editing it. See that there's actually information missing there. So editing JPEGs isn't the best option in this sense, but generally if I use this and I just want to brighten up and make the picture a little more vibrant, I'll just drag this in maybe up to 4 or 6, whichever, just a little bit, drag it in, and then you can turn it on and off to see, turn this layer off, on and off to see the difference. So it's just a subtle difference, but it has helped deepen, basically it's made it more contrasty. That's another way of adjusting your contrast. If I find my shadows and highlights are acceptable and I just want to brighten the picture a little bit, I can just drag the mid-tones up a little bit. So I make them a little bit brighter. Okay, so I'll drag it. If I want to increase the mid-tones towards the shadows, I want to affect the shadows more, I drag it to the left. If I want to affect the highlights, drag it to the right. So this is your midtones. Set it on 1 for the center, and anywhere either side of that is going to affect it. So if I set this slightly to the left, I can double check and see, okay, it's made everything a bit more bright. Okay, so instead of trashing this, if I want to now add to this, I can just go down and put another adjustment layer. So curves, similar to highlight, similar to the levels, I can go to curves, and this brings up this curve. It's often said if you want a good adjustment, your curve needs to look like an S. So you click it in the middle here, you drag this one to the left, and you'll see this one automatically adjusts the same. So you can do your adjustments that way as well. You can either adjust as an overall RGB, or you can adjust individual channels. So your image, if it's an RGB image, is separated into 3 channels: your red, green, and blue. And this curves then lets you adjust each channel separately, which will also be like color correcting. Because if I just adjust the red and drag that, this is your highlights on this side here. This is your shadows. Once again, shadows, highlights. So if I drag this corner, I'm going to affect the highlights mostly. It's very red, so this picture's already very red. I want to take the red out. I can just drag this down, and it'll reduce the red in the picture. So I'm making it a bit more green. If I bring it down to, say, this line here, I can say, well, it's a bit green. I can go into the green channel, and I can bring that down as well. A little bit of the green, reduce it somewhat. Add a bit blue in. I can drag the blue this way, put a bit more blue in the highlights. Okay, so now if I go back to the RGB view, it'll show each of the channels that I've adjusted. So I pulled the red down there, pulled the blue a little bit to the left, and the overall adjustment curve, I've basically lightened the highlights, darkened the shadows. This is basically what that curve's telling me. As I go S around here, the shadows pulling this way, darkened them, highlight pulling this way, lightened them. So I've lightened the shadows, lightened the highlights, darkened the shadows. So that's the levels, or the curves, shall I say. If I switch that off and go back before the curves, that was before the curves, that's with the curves. So that's also quite useful for color correcting and your basically brightness, contrast, that kind of thing. You can adjust all in one. Going back to adjustment levels, adjustment layers. Exposure, this you can adjust your gamma and your exposure. So like I said, this I'd usually do in RAW. I always shoot with RAW. Unless I'm at an event shoot where I'm shooting JPEG version. It's just quicker than converting to RAW to JPEG later, because you want the stuff out as soon as possible. So generally I'm shooting RAW. So I'd do this kind of adjustment in RAW, setting the exposure. As you can see, this is basically the representation of my original image. So with all these adjustments, you can see how it's really taken a knock on the image. You know, all these holes everywhere. It's not a smooth histogram. So your histogram, you ideally, if I turn this off, you ideally want your histogram to be solid like that. That's showing you a good, healthy image. So keeping in mind, the more adjustments you do to your image, the more damage you're doing to the pixels. It's not always visible. So if I zoom in 100%, it's very grainy because this was shot at a high ISO. Because of the low light conditions. Here's another wonderful shortcut. If I want to just see a before and after without these other layers switched on, if I hold my Alt or Option key, Option on the Mac, Alt on the PC, and I click on this little eye here, whatever layer I click on, it will only keep that layer on and turn the rest off. So if I hold Alt or Option and I click here, it'll turn the other layers off and just leave that one on. So it'll give you a nice before. Once again, holding Alt, I click it again, it'll turn all the others on. So showing me before and after. So I've lost quite a bit of detail in this area here. I've basically overexposed this area here now, so it looks a bit bad. So if I want to, I can go back into the exposure, I can drag it back down a bit just to make sure that these highlights come back in here. Okay, so there we go, looks nice. Let's go back to Alt, turn it on, turn it off. I can double check and see if it's actually where I want it to be. Okay, Alt or Option, Command or Control 0 to fill my screen again, or fit the screen. Going back here, Vibrance is exactly what it says. It's just going to basically intensify the color. Hue and Saturation, we've gone over that one. Color Balance, this is once again changing the hues. You can adjust separate elements. So first you can do your shadows, you can do your midtones, you can do your highlights. Depends on, you have to create a separate balance layer for each one that you select. Let's do midtones. Still looking very red. So this is a nice representation of the color spectrum. So to compensate for the amount of red, you'd have to add more blue, basically what it's saying. So if we drag this way, we're adding more blue to it. Come on. Click and drag. You can get a real-time view of the effect it's having as you drag on your image if you look at your image. So switching that on and off, you can see the subtle difference it's made. It's taken a bit of more red out, made it look a little bit more realistic. Adding blue. So that's your color adjustment or color balance layer. Black and white. This will actually convert your picture to a black and white. So it'll add black and white, but it'll let you have. So basically, where there were reds, you can then modify and add more black to that part of the image, or lighten up the red elements. So keeping in mind, looking at your black and white image, you're still thinking of it as color, and you can adjust separate colors that relate to that image by changing. So black and white isn't just black and white. You can really make your black and whites pop by enhancing certain colors. So that's quite a useful tool when creating a black and white, rather than just going here, going image mode, grayscale. I mean, this really will just flatten it out. No, I don't want to flatten. I'll just go like that. But you get the gist of things. So it's basically converted. If I switch off all the other layers now, hold Alt, click this eye, go back to the background color. That's the black and white is created from the original file, which isn't spectacular. So you take that, let's go back in history and turn that off. You'll see this is a lot more vibrant. Okay, so it's a much more effective black and white option. Here's your adjustment layer. Okay, this is actually the one I wanted to use for this tutorial. It's the photo filter. For those who come from the film days, you'd maybe be familiar with Koken filters perhaps, or trying to think what the other brands are, but Koken was the brand I used. Basically a colored piece of glass or film that you'd put in front of your lens. That would then give you either an effect or basically a color balance. So if you're shooting on regular film, daylight film, and you're inside, and you got a tungsten bulb and you need to counteract that, you'd add a blue filter to the front of your lens to balance that yellow tungsten light. This is basically exactly what that is. So before I add that, I want to go back. I'm just going to reset all of this to the original image. So this is the original yellow. So this is basically the setup we have. We've taken a shot indoors, theoretically with daylight film, and so we're seeing the tungsten bulbs reflecting yellow, and we need to compensate for that. So I'm going to add a photo filter to the front of my lens, so to speak. Okay, I don't want to put a warming filter on. Like I said, the opposite of red, as we saw in that illustration of color balance. If we go to color balance here, the opposite of red will be blue, opposite of green will be magenta, opposite yellow will be blue. So those are the values you would add to compensate for your colors. So I'm just going to undo Apple Control Z. Get rid of that. Back to our photo filter, making sure that's layer selected. I can then select a filter I want to add to it. So I usually use the cooling filter 82, which is quite a harsh effect. It adds quite a bit in there. But you can edit the density or the amount of blue it adds. So you can really push it up, but then it becomes too blue. So this is quite handy. Usually from the standard, the default value is roughly around here. So anything from here right down to about 7 I found quite useful for whitening up an image, because a lot of times if you're shooting in shadows or indoors, you're going to get a little bit of yellow tint to your pictures. So this is a wonderful filter that I use quite often to level out the playing field and give it more of a realistic representation. So depending on the calibration of your monitor and what your eyes tell you, all of us see the world differently. So my eyes are telling me that looks pretty good right there. I kind of like that. Also, according to your flavor, if you like a warm image, something with a bit more feeling in it, you can bring it down a bit and have a bit more warmth in their faces. Myself, I enjoy more realistic neutral colors, so I'll just up it a bit. And that's basically the quick and easy way to color balance something that looks like that. So just add a photo filter. That'll be one of your best friends in color balancing, especially if you shot as JPEG. If you shot RAW, then you can sort this out very easily in RAW by just changing your color white balance settings and then editing or adjusting slightly the tone of that white balance. So that's the one I actually wanted to show you. These are special effects, shall I say. Selective color is actually quite useful. This lets you adjust specific colors in this picture. So if I select selective color, I've now balanced my light using my photo filter. I want to now adjust the colors in this picture. So for example, this red looks a little bit dirty. I can select my red to give me all the different colors in this image. Well, not in the image, but it gives these are the different colors within the image I can affect. So if I select the reds, it's going to adjust basically the colors that have red in them. Like I said, this is a bit dirty, so maybe I want to pull some of the black out of it. Add a bit of magenta, yellow to it. Pull a bit of cyan. I think the cyan is what's making the reds dirty. You don't want to pull your blacks too much because then you wash out your image. So rather adjust with the cyan and up the intensity of yellow and magenta. I'm sure you know yellow and magenta make, or yellow and pink make red. Yellow and blue make green. So your basic color principles. Okay, so if I switch that on and off, you'll see the before and after. So even the faces have a tint of red in them, so you can see they've been affected too. So you just got to be careful. I'll have to show you masking in the next tutorial because that's going to come really in handy when it comes to this. Masking is also one of your best friends. All of these others I already use. Threshold has its place. It has a specific function. You can use it for various things, but it's not really for editing. As you can see, it's quite harsh. It gives a hard line. It basically lets you create a selection. So if you want more of a poster look, you can adjust how much by dragging this little selector here, how much detail you have in your selection. Okay, so that's threshold, which is quite hectic. You can often use that to make a selection, to make a mask for editing. Oops, I just created a second mask. Okay, ignore that one. Let's go back down to inverts. Invert basically exactly what it says. It's going to invert the image, make a negative really of your image. So if you want that negative look, or for example this tutorial, for tutorial purposes, if you're talking about negatives, you can do an inversion of that base layer. Posterize, it's kind of difficult to illustrate with the invert on. I want to trash the invert. Posterize is exactly what it is. It creates like a poster effect, kind of a surreal, not really lifelike. The intensity of it depends on how far you drag this up. So the further down, the more hectic it is. You can see, let me zoom in a little bit for you, and you'll see you get like this non-smooth gradient happening on the phases. So you drag it down, you can see it's becoming more and more almost illustrated. So that's effect you can create more for design than for photography. So posterize. Okay, so those are adjustment layers. So I've taught you about adjustment layers, and primarily what this was supposed to be about was basically just color correction. So color correction using a photo filter. In the next lesson we'll talk a little bit more about masks, because we'll be using that frequently throughout all the other elements that we've shown you. Okay, see you next time.